November 1944, Eastern France, 6 degrees above zero. A single rifle shot cracked into the frozen dark, and nobody answered. Not because German troops had broken the roadblock, not because the line had collapsed. Because Private Daniel Reeves, 20 years old, farm-raised outside Bowling Green, Kentucky, had lifted his M1 rifle toward the dead gray sky and fired one round for the simplest reason a soldier can have. He wanted proof that he still existed. He had been standing at the same checkpoint for 19 hours. His relief was 14 hours late. His last hot meal was yesterday morning. And every man above him in the chain of command had somehow found a way to believe that someone else had handled it. Nobody had. The shot disappeared into the sleet. The road stayed empty. Reeves lowered the rifle, pulled his collar tighter around his neck, and went back to his orders. Stop the vehicles, challenge the drivers, hold the road until relieved. That was the order. So he held it. This is not really a story about one cold private. And it is not really a story about one angry general. It is about the thin line that runs from the highest officer in an army to the lowest man in the mud, and what happens when that line freezes, frays, and finally snaps. Because before the night was over, a 3-star general would walk into a warm farmhouse behind the line, find 9 officers eating at a table they had no right to be sitting at, and give one order that none of them forgot. The private would sleep in the bed. The officers would sleep where the private had been. And George S. Patton would prove something the Third Army would need to remember in a few weeks. When the Germans came through the Ardennes, and every comfortable assumption in the Allied command was smashed in the snow. By November of 1944, everybody wanted the war to feel almost finished. Normandy was behind them. Paris had been liberated. The German army was falling back toward its own border, losing men, fuel, and ground faster than it could replace them. In staff rooms and headquarters tents, officers spoke about the end with the dangerous confidence of men who had begun to confuse momentum with victory. Christmas was coming. Germany was exhausted. One more push, maybe 2, and the thing would be over. But the roads in Lorraine told a different story. They were not parade roads. They were not the clean map arrows from newsreels. They were mud, ice, sleet, dead engines, flooded ditches, empty ration tins, and infantrymen trying to sleep in coats that never dried. The rifles were cold enough to burn bare skin. Boot leather cracked. Trucks slid sideways off narrow roads and stayed there because there were not enough recovery vehicles to pull every machine out of every ditch. The Germans had not stopped fighting. They had simply chosen ground that punished the men trying to chase them, and inside that punishment something quieter began to happen. Officers found houses, not palaces, not luxury, just farmhouses with roofs, fireplaces, dry floors, and doors that shut against the wind. A place like that could change a man faster than fear could. 1 hour by a fire became 2. A cup of wine became a reason to finish a conversation. A dry blanket became a reason to let the sergeant check the line. The sergeant assumed the lieutenant had already checked it. The lieutenant assumed the corporal had sent relief. The corporal assumed nobody would leave a man out there if it mattered. And that is how a soldier disappears in an army that has not lost him on a map. Not all at once, not with malice, by assumption, by warmth. By each man stepping 1 inch back from responsibility until the private at the end of the line is standing alone in the sleet. Daniel Reeves had reported to the checkpoint at Twin Houses at 300 hours. It was a road control point on a supply route west of the Moselle, ugly and important, the kind of place nobody remembers unless it fails. His orders were routine. Challenge traffic, check passes, watch for infiltrators. Keep the road open for fuel, ammunition, field kitchens, ambulances, and staff cars moving toward the forward units. His relief was scheduled at 0500. 6 hours, long enough to hurt, not long enough to kill a man if the system did what it was supposed to do. At 05, nobody came. At 0600, Reeves told himself the roads were bad. At 0800, he stopped telling himself anything. The sleet had soaked through the seams of his field jacket. His gloves were stiff. His canteen had iced over at the neck. He walked short circles in the road, because if he stood still too long, his feet stopped feeling like feet and started feeling like objects inside his boots. A supply truck passed just after noon. He checked the papers. The driver cursed the weather. Reeves almost asked him to carry a message. Almost. But the order in his head was stronger than the pain in his legs. Hold until relieved, so he let the truck go. By late afternoon, the cold had become something personal. It was no longer weather. It was an argument. Every minute said, leave. Every order said, stay, and Reeves stayed. Then, somewhere after dusk, he fired one round straight upward. It was not a signal taught in any manual. It was not a coded request. It was just one human sound thrown into a world that had gone too quiet around him. Nobody answered. At 2100 hours, headlights appeared through the sleet. Reeves stepped into the road the way he had stepped into it all day, rifle up. Voice cracked from cold. Advance and be recognized. The Jeep slowed. A driver leaned forward. An aide in the passenger seat looked annoyed. Then the man in the rear seat turned his face toward the headlight wash, and Reeves saw the stars. 3 of them. George Smith Patton Jr. stepped out into the sleet. He was not dressed for a ceremonial photograph. He was wrapped in winter gear, boots wet, jaw tight, helmet low, the kind of tired that made his eyes look sharper rather than duller. Reeves snapped to attention so hard his knees almost gave. Patton looked at him for half a second and said, at ease. Then he asked 3 questions. When did you come on post? 2300 last night, sir. When were you supposed to be relieved? 0500, sir. When did you last eat? Reeves hesitated, not because he did not know, because the answer sounded wrong once a general was standing close enough to hear it. Yesterday morning, sir. Patton did not shout. That was what Reeves remembered first. The general did not need volume. The facts had already done the shouting. Patton turned to his aide. Write it down. The aide opened a notebook. Patton asked the unit, the company, the platoon, the name of the squad leader, the location of the nearest command post. Reeves gave what he knew, and what he knew was the worst part of it. He knew his orders. He knew the road. He knew the hour. He did not know where the men responsible for him had gone. That was the failure. Not the cold, not the night, not even the missing meal. A private could endure cold, a private could endure hunger, but no army could endure officers who did not know where their men were. The aide worked backward through the chain. A corporal was found in a shed near a truck park. A sergeant was found asleep beside a stove. The platoon lieutenant was not at the platoon. The company officers, the corporal finally said, were in a village 2 kilometers back, a stone farmhouse, lights on, vehicles outside, warm place. Patton got back into the Jeep. He did not tell Reeves to leave the post, not yet. The line had to be corrected in the right order. First, find the men who had broken it. The farmhouse was easy to find because it was the only building in the village that looked as if the war had taken the night off. Light pushed through the shutters. Smoke rose cleanly from the chimney. 3 Jeeps and 2 staff cars sat along the lane, their hoods glazed white. Inside, someone had found music, not loud music. Worse, comfortable music, the kind men play when they have decided the danger is elsewhere. Patton stood outside for a moment and looked at the windows. Then he opened the door. Heat rolled out. The room went silent in pieces. First the conversation, then the laughter. Then, a few seconds later, the phonograph, when a lieutenant with loose boots finally had the sense to lift the needle. 9 officers stood around a long kitchen table. 2 captains. 6 lieutenants, 1 major. Their jackets were off. Their plates were full. There was bread on the table, sausage, potatoes, a half-carved ham, and 3 open bottles of wine that had not come from any American ration crate. A fire was burning so hot that the stones around the hearth were sweating. Patton did not ask permission, he walked past them. Upstairs he found beds, not cots, beds. Civilian beds made with folded blankets and linen sheets. One room had 2 officers' helmets on the chair. Another had boots placed neatly beside the bed. A pillow still carried the dent of a head. Patton stood there long enough to let the sight become evidence. Then he came back down. The officers were still standing. No one had touched the food. No one had found a sentence that could survive being spoken. Patton moved to the fireplace, not to warm himself, to make the contrast impossible to ignore. Behind him the fire burned. In front of him 9 officers waited. Outside, on a road none of them had walked that day, a private was still standing in the sleet. Patton said, "There is a man on your road." He gave them Reeves's name, his post time, his relief time, the current hour, the last time he had eaten. He gave it to them like a ledger. Then he looked at the major. "Tell me which number is acceptable." The major swallowed. "Sir, there must have been a confusion in the rotation." Patton cut him off. "No. Confusion is when 2 trucks are sent to the same bridge. Confusion is when a map coordinate is copied wrong in the dark. This is not confusion." He pointed toward the windows. "This is comfort replacing command." No one moved. Patton's voice stayed low. "An army is a line. It runs from me to you, from you to your lieutenants, from your lieutenants to their sergeants, and from them down to the private standing where you sent him. That line is not made of paper, it is made of attention. When you stop paying attention, the line breaks." He turned toward the table, and tonight it broke at the warmest room in the village. Then the orders came. Clean, fast, final. Private Reeves would be brought to the farmhouse. He would eat from that table. He would sleep in the best bed upstairs, whichever one he chose. Every officer in the room would report immediately to the most exposed forward position in his sector. Not a covered command post, not a barn, not a cellar, exposed ground. They would take no food, no wine, no blankets, no firewood. They would remain there until released by 3rd Army headquarters. The captain nearest the door opened his mouth. Patton looked at him once. The mouth closed. The officers put on their coats. Boots were tightened with fingers that suddenly seemed clumsy. One lieutenant reached for his gloves on the table. Patton said, "Leave them." The lieutenant froze. Patton looked at the fire again. "Your private has been learning without gloves all day. You can learn for one night." Within minutes the farmhouse emptied. The warmth stayed behind. So did the food. So did the beds. So did the point. 40 minutes later, Reeves stepped through the same doorway. He did not understand the room at first. Very cold men do not trust warmth immediately. He stood just inside the threshold with his shoulders hunched, rifle still in his hand, eyes moving from the table to the fire to the stairs. Patton's aide took the rifle. "Sit down, Private." Reeves sat. A plate was put in front of him. Bread, meat, potatoes, hot coffee black enough to taste like medicine. He ate slowly at first, because hunger that deep has to be convinced it is allowed to continue. Then he stopped pretending. He ate like a man whose body had been waiting for permission. After the meal, the aide took him upstairs. There were 3 rooms. Reeves looked into each one. He chose the smallest. The bed had not been slept in. That mattered to him for reasons he did not explain. He took off his boots. His socks were stiff with ice. He folded his jacket at the foot of the bed, because discipline had not left him just because someone else's had. Then he lay down. He was asleep before the candle burned down an inch. Outside, 9 officers walked into the sleet. Some found shell holes, some found drainage cuts, some stood behind stone walls that blocked the wind badly and the cold not at all. By morning, every one of them was alive. Cold, wet, furious, ashamed, alive. The same condition their men had been expected to treat as normal. Patton did not do it because he enjoyed theatrical punishment. That is the easy version. The easy version turns the story into temper. But the harder truth is that Patton understood something about command that softer men only discovered after disaster. You cannot lead conditions you refuse to enter. You cannot trust reports more than faces. You cannot know the state of an army from a warm room 2 kilometers behind the men who are paying the actual price. A commander who does not look at his soldiers will eventually begin commanding an imaginary army. And imaginary armies do not hold roads. They do not pivot under fire. They do not break through to surrounded towns in winter. They collapse the first time reality refuses to match the briefing. That was why the night on the road mattered. Not because one private got a bed. Because an entire chain of command was reminded that the lowest man in the system is not the least important man in the system. He is where the system proves whether it still works. And within a month, the Third Army would need every link of that system. Because on December 16, 1944, the Germans attacked through the Ardennes. The attack was not supposed to happen. Allied intelligence had seen fragments, fuel movements, radio silence, strange concentrations, reports from the forest. But most officers read those signs through the same comfortable belief that had poisoned the farmhouses in Lorraine. Germany was nearly done. Germany could not mount a major offensive. Germany did not have the fuel, the weather, the reserves, or the time. Then, at dawn, the forest erupted. German armor and infantry crashed into the thinnest part of the Allied line. American units were split, surrounded, overrun, or forced back through roads already clogged with snow, wreckage, refugees, and retreating vehicles. The offensive cut a bulge into the Allied front that grew by the hour. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne and attached units found themselves surrounded at the road junction the Germans needed most. A crossroads town in winter became the hinge of the Western Front. Hold it, and the German advance lost its rhythm. Lose it, and the enemy's armored columns could pour deeper into Belgium. At headquarters, men who had been saying almost over began speaking in numbers. How many divisions? How many roads? How much fuel? How many hours before Bastogne could no longer hold? On December 19, senior Allied commanders met at Verdun. The room was cold. The mood was colder. General Eisenhower wanted the German attack treated not as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity to cut off and destroy the enemy's last armored reserve. But first, someone had to move fast enough to hit the southern flank, fast enough to matter. Most answers around the room were careful. The roads were ice. The units were facing east, not north. Turning an army in winter was not like turning a line on a map. It meant changing march routes, fuel routes, artillery plans, hospital routes, ammunition schedules, bridge priorities, traffic control, and command relationships while the enemy was moving and the weather was trying to kill everyone. Then Patton said he could attack north with 3 divisions within 48 hours. The room did not like the sentence. It sounded like confidence pretending to be planning. A staff officer said it could not be done. Patton did not argue the weather. He did not deny the roads. He did not pretend tanks could move without fuel or men could fight without food. He simply knew what his staff had already prepared. Because days earlier, before the conference, before the full size of the German attack was obvious, Patton had ordered contingency plans for a northward pivot, not because he had been told to, because a commander who is paying attention does not wait for reality to become official. The plans were ready. The march tables existed, the routes had been studied, the fuel figures had been worked. The orders were not finished because Eisenhower said, "Go." They were finished because Patton had refused to let his army think only in the direction it was already facing. Within hours, the Third Army began turning north. 90,000 men, tanks, tank destroyers, field artillery, medical units, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, engineers, military police trying to turn frozen roads into arteries instead of traffic jams. An army that had been driving east toward Germany swung 90 degrees in winter and moved toward Bastogne. This is where the farmhouse lesson became more than a story, Because a movement that large cannot be forced from the top alone. A general can order the turn. He cannot personally guide every truck past every frozen ditch. He cannot walk every column. He cannot feed every rifleman. He cannot make every lieutenant understand why the delay of one platoon can become the delay of an entire division. The army had to know itself. Officers had to know where their men were. Sergeants had to know who was missing, who was frozen, who had ammunition, who had not eaten, who could still march, who was lying because he did not want to be pulled from the column. The line of attention had to hold, and this time it did. The Third Army moved with a violence that looked simple only after it was over. The maps show arrows. The men lived the grinding truth beneath them. Engines started at 3 in the morning in temperatures below zero. Drivers slept 10 minutes at a time against steering wheels. Military police waved convoys through crossroads by flashlight. Infantrymen climbed off trucks to push other trucks out of ice ruts, then climbed back on before their sweat could freeze. Tank crews warmed metal parts with their hands and cursed when skin stuck. Cooks served whatever could be heated quickly. Mechanics worked until wrenches felt welded to their gloves, and above them, the officers who had learned the cost of warmth too far from the line walked, counted, checked, and checked again. By December 26, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The 101st Airborne was still there, hungry, exhausted, low on ammunition, but still holding. The relief of Bastogne did not end the Battle of the Bulge that day. The killing continued for weeks. The cold continued. The German army did not vanish because one corridor opened, but the strategic dream behind the offensive had been broken. Bastogne had not fallen. The crossroads remained in American hands. The German timetable began to bleed out in the snow, and in the accounting of how the Third Army moved fast enough to make that possible, the answer is not just Patton's boldness. Boldness is cheap if nobody beneath you can execute it. The real answer is preparation, trust, and attention distributed down a chain that still knew how to find its last man. The private on the road, the officers in the sleet, the contingency orders waiting before anyone asked for them. They were all the same lesson. An army does not become fast when the general shouts move. It becomes fast when every man responsible for another man already knows where he is, what he needs, and what will fail if no one checks. By spring of 1945, the Third Army was driving through Germany with a speed that surprised enemy commanders and exhausted its own supply officers. The front was breaking apart. German units still fought hard in towns, river crossings, forests, and roadblocks, but the larger structure around them was cracking. American armor reached places German planners had believed were still days away from danger. Bridges became races, fuel dumps became prizes. Orders written in German headquarters were sometimes obsolete before they arrived. The usual seams of a fast-moving army were harder to find. The gaps between units, the delays between order and action, the freezing uncertainty that appears when a platoon loses radio contact and no one knows whether to wait or go. Again and again, Third Army units kept moving because lower officers understood the commander's intent and remained close enough to their men to act without asking permission for every step. That was not magic. It was not luck. It was the opposite of the farmhouse. The farmhouse had been officers detached from the conditions beneath them. The spring advance was officers tied back to those conditions, checking boots, fuel, food, ammunition, road space, and morale with the same seriousness they checked maps. No speech can replace that. No slogan can fake it. Men know whether they are being seen. They know whether the officer beside them is sharing risk or managing appearances. They know whether the questions are real. When did your shift start? When was your relief due? When did you last eat? Those are not complicated questions. That is why they are so hard to excuse. After the war, most men like Daniel Reeves disappeared back into ordinary life. That is not an insult. It is the truth of the men who did the work. The records remember divisions, rivers, towns, casualties, prisoners, commanders, and dates. They do not always remember the man standing alone at a checkpoint in Sleek because someone forgot that attention is not paperwork. Maybe Reeves went home with frost scars on his feet. Maybe he never told the whole story. Maybe he told it once and then decided silence was easier. The important thing is not whether his name became famous. It did not need to. For one night he had been the evidence. The lowest man in the chain had revealed the condition of the whole chain, and Patton understood the evidence the moment he saw it. A hungry private on a frozen road is not a small administrative error. It is a warning flare. It says the system is beginning to love its own comfort more than its own purpose. It says responsibility has become indirect. It says men are being managed instead of led. Patton corrected it brutally because winter was not going to be gentle, and neither was the enemy. The officers needed to remember the cold while memory could still save lives. That is why the image lasts, not the famous tank columns, not the polished boots, not the speeches. A road, a jeep, a private who stayed because his orders told him to, a general who stopped because the man at the bottom of the chain mattered enough to interrupt the night, and 3 questions that cut through every excuse in the army. When did you start? When were you supposed to be relieved? When did you last eat? Leadership often pretends to be vision. Sometimes it is. But before it is vision, it is attention. The kind that walks the line, the kind that notices the missing man, the kind that refuses to let warmth become blindness, because a chain of command is not proven by how loudly orders move downward. It is proven by whether care can move downward with them. On that frozen road in eastern France, the order finally reached the bottom, and because it did, the line held.